Your neighbor knocks on your door 72 hours after the power went out. He's holding a baseball bat. Behind him are 3 other men from your street. They're not here to share supplies. They're here to take yours. This exact scenario played out on a residential street in New Orleans during Katrina. 5 blocks away, a different neighborhood responded to the same blackout by organizing shared meals, security patrols, and resource pooling. Same city, same disaster, same economic demographic. One street formed a functional militia that protected everyone. The other street turned into a predatory hunting ground where the prepared became targets. The difference between these outcomes wasn't luck, it wasn't guns, it wasn't supplies. It was predictable based on factors you can measure right now by looking out your window. Today, we're examining the actual social science of neighborhood collapse, what determines whether your street cooperates or cannibalizes, and how to assess which way your specific block will break when the grid fails.
Let's start with the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to acknowledge. Your neighborhood has already decided which way it's going. The pattern is set. The social dynamics that will determine whether your street organizes mutual aid or turns predatory already exist in how your neighbors interact today. You're not going to create community cooperation from scratch when the lights go out. You're going to see the existing social structure either strengthen into organized mutual aid or collapse into competitive predation. The difference is visible right now if you know what to look for. Disaster researchers have spent decades studying this. They've identified specific predictive factors that determine neighborhood response to extended crisis. Some of these factors you can change, most you cannot. All of them you need to assess honestly because your survival probability depends more on your street's social structure than on your personal stockpile.
The first and most powerful predictor is what sociologists call social capital, which is a clinical term for how much your neighbors actually know and trust each other before crisis hits. This isn't about everyone being friends. This is about the density of pre-existing relationships and the frequency of casual interaction. Researchers measure this by counting how many neighbors know each other's names, how often people have casual conversations, whether there are regular gatherings or shared activities, and whether neighbors have ever helped each other with small favors. Streets with high social capital before disaster consistently organize cooperative responses during disaster. Streets with low social capital consistently fragment into competitive or predatory behavior. The mechanism is simple. Trust can't be built under stress. It can only be activated under stress if it already exists. When your street loses power for 3 days and you need to know whether the guy 4 houses down will share his generator or steal your supplies, the answer was determined by whether you've ever spoken to him before that moment. The data from Hurricane Katrina demonstrates this with brutal clarity. Researchers from Tulane and LSU conducted extensive interviews with survivors from different New Orleans neighborhoods. They found that streets where neighbors regularly gathered, even for something as simple as sitting on porches and talking, organized mutual aid within 24 hours of the levees breaking. Streets where people drove into garages and closed the door without interacting took 72 hours to organize anything, and by then, predatory patterns had already established. The difference wasn't income, wasn't race, wasn't gun ownership. It was whether neighbors had built social capital through hundreds of small interactions before the disaster. One street had a monthly block party tradition. They had a communication tree for organizing it. When Katrina hit, that same communication tree became their security and resource coordination network within hours. 3 blocks away, a street with identical houses and nearly identical demographics had no pre-existing social structure. That street saw home invasions, resource hoarding, and several violent confrontations before external authorities restored order. The second major factor is what researchers call network closure, which measures whether your street's social connections are internal or external. A neighborhood with high network closure means most people's friends and family live on the same street or in immediately adjacent blocks. A neighborhood with low network closure means people's social connections are primarily elsewhere.
They drive to work in different areas, their friends live across town, and the street is just where they sleep. Network closure predicts crisis response because it determines whether people stay or leave when disaster hits. Neighborhoods with high network closure see residents stay and organize because their entire support system is geographically concentrated. Neighborhoods with low network closure see rapid abandonment as people flee to wherever their actual social networks are located. This creates a self-fulfilling collapse. As people leave, remaining residents become increasingly isolated and defensive rather than cooperative. The 1977 New York City Blackout provides a natural experiment on this factor. The blackout affected the entire city equally, but neighborhood responses varied dramatically. In parts of Brooklyn where extended families lived within blocks of each other and social life centered on the neighborhood, residents organized street-level mutual defense and resource sharing within hours. In Manhattan neighborhoods where residents were primarily young professionals who worked elsewhere and socialized elsewhere, the response was immediate evacuation. Those who stayed faced isolation and couldn't organize effective cooperation because they were strangers to each other despite living in the same building for years. Researchers tracking this found that network closure explained 70% of the variance in neighborhood cooperation rates. Streets where people's lives were geographically concentrated cooperated. Streets where people's lives were geographically dispersed collapsed into every man for himself within 24 hours. The third critical factor is economic diversity within the neighborhood. This one is counterintuitive and makes people uncomfortable, but the data is consistent across dozens of disasters. Economically homogeneous neighborhoods, whether uniformly poor or uniformly wealthy, tend toward cooperative responses during crisis. Economically diverse neighborhoods, where income varies significantly from house to house, tend toward predatory responses. The mechanism appears to be perceived fairness and resentment. In homogeneous neighborhoods, everyone faces similar resource constraints and similar capabilities. Crisis is a shared experience. In diverse neighborhoods, crisis exposes and amplifies existing economic inequality. Residents with fewer resources resent those with more. Residents with more resources fear those with less. This dynamic poisons cooperation before it can form. The resentment and fear that existed beneath the surface during normal times becomes active predation and defensive hoarding during crisis. Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico demonstrated this pattern at scale. Researchers studying neighborhood responses across the island found that uniformly middle-class neighborhoods organized shared resources and mutual security rapidly. Uniformly poor neighborhoods also organized cooperation, often more effectively than wealthier areas, because residents had more experience with scarcity and mutual aid. But neighborhoods with significant economic mixing, where wealthy homes sat adjacent to poor homes, saw immediate fragmentation. The wealthy hoarded and fortified. The poor formed raiding groups. Cooperation attempts failed because neither group trusted the other's intentions. One particularly stark example involved two adjacent streets in San Juan. One street was uniformly lower middle class. The other street mixed million-dollar homes with modest houses. The homogeneous street formed a functioning resource pool and security rotation within 48 hours. The mixed street saw 3 home invasions and complete social breakdown in the same time frame. Researchers interviewing residents found that the mixed street had almost no social interaction before the hurricane, despite living side by side for years, while the homogeneous street had regular block parties and shared childcare.
The fourth factor is average age and the presence of families with children. This is one of the few factors that consistently predicts cooperation across all other variables. Neighborhoods with a high percentage of families with school-aged children organize mutual aid faster and more effectively than neighborhoods dominated by either young adults without children or retirees. The mechanism is straightforward. Parents have overwhelming motivation to create safe, stable environments for their children, and they recognize that cooperation serves this goal better than competition. Additionally, schools create natural social networks between parents before crisis hits. If your kids go to school together, you already know the other parents. You've already worked together on school projects or sports teams. That pre-existing cooperation framework activates rapidly during crisis. The presence of children also moderates aggressive behavior. Streets full of families think twice before predatory actions because children witnessing violence creates long-term social consequences that adults without children don't weight as heavily. The data from the 2021 Texas freeze validates this factor powerfully. Neighborhoods with high concentrations of young families organized welfare checks, resource sharing, and communal warming centers in homes with fireplaces within 24 hours. These neighborhoods had lower mortality rates and lower rates of property crime during the crisis. Neighborhoods dominated by either young single adults or retirees had significantly slower organization and higher rates of every-man-for-himself behavior. One subdivision in Austin provides the perfect contrast. The northern section of the subdivision was primarily young families. The southern section was primarily young professionals and retirees. Same builder, same house designs, same infrastructure failure. The northern section organized a communication network through school parent groups and created rotating warming shelters in different homes. 0 deaths, 0 thefts reported. The southern section had 4 deaths from hypothermia, multiple pipe bursts from abandoned homes, and several reported break-ins. The difference was the presence of children creating both social capital before the crisis and motivation for cooperation during it.
The fifth major predictor is what researchers call institutional memory of crisis, meaning whether your neighborhood has experienced and survived a previous extended emergency together. This factor is powerful but tricky because it's binary. Either your street has been through crisis together or it hasn't. You can't create this factor. You can only know whether it exists. Neighborhoods with prior shared crisis experience organize faster, cooperate more effectively, and show dramatically lower rates of predatory behavior during subsequent crises. The mechanism is learned trust. Neighbors who successfully cooperated during one emergency have proven to each other that cooperation works and that the people around them can be trusted under stress. They've also worked out logistics, identified who has what skills and resources, and established informal leadership structures. All of this activates rapidly when the next crisis hits. New Orleans provides the clearest example of this factor because the city experienced both Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and Hurricane Ida in 2021. Neighborhoods that survived Katrina together showed radically different responses to Ida compared to their Katrina response. Streets that organized mutual aid during Katrina activated the same networks during Ida within hours rather than days. They knew who to check on, who had generators, who had medical training, who could organize security patrols. Their cooperation response time dropped by more than 50%. Conversely, neighborhoods that fragmented during Katrina showed similar fragmentation during Ida, despite 16 years between events, because the institutional memory was one of distrust rather than cooperation. One neighborhood that formed an effective mutual aid network during Katrina maintained an annual hurricane preparedness meeting every year afterward, even though no major hurricanes hit during that period. When Ida arrived, their activation was essentially immediate. They had current contact information, updated resource inventories, and established roles. A neighborhood 3 miles away that descended into looting during Katrina saw similar patterns during Ida, despite completely different residents living there, because the social structure never changed.
The sixth factor is the physical design of the neighborhood itself. This is the most overlooked predictor, but it matters enormously. Street layout, housing density, sight lines, and the presence or absence of shared spaces predict social capital formation and crisis response. Neighborhoods designed with front porches, sidewalks, and shared common areas generate significantly more casual social interaction, which builds the social capital that predicts cooperation. Neighborhoods designed around garage access, privacy fencing, and isolated lots generate minimal social interaction, which predicts fragmentation during crisis. This isn't speculation. Urban planners and sociologists have decades of research demonstrating that physical design determines social interaction patterns, and social interaction patterns determine crisis response. The contrast between traditional grid pattern neighborhoods and modern cul-de-sac subdivisions illustrates this perfectly. Grid neighborhoods with sidewalks and front porches generate what researchers call passive contact, meaning neighbors see each other regularly, just going about daily life without planning interaction. This passive contact builds familiarity and low-level trust over time. Cul-de-sac neighborhoods designed for garage access and privacy fencing generate almost zero passive contact. Neighbors can live adjacent for years without ever speaking because daily routines involve pulling into garages and closing the door behind them. During the 2021 Texas freeze, traditional neighborhood designs organized mutual aid significantly faster than modern subdivisions, despite the subdivisions having higher average incomes and more resources. The physical design had created the social capital necessary for cooperation in one case and prevented it in the other.
The seventh and final major factor is ethnic and cultural homogeneity, and this is where we enter territory that makes people deeply uncomfortable, but cannot be ignored if we're examining actual data rather than wishful thinking. Neighborhoods with high ethnic and cultural homogeneity cooperate more effectively during crisis than neighborhoods with high diversity. This pattern appears consistently across disasters worldwide and across different ethnic groups. It's not about which ethnicity, it's about homogeneity itself. The mechanism appears to be shared cultural assumptions about behavior, communication styles, and mutual obligation. Homogeneous groups coordinate faster because they're operating from shared cultural frameworks that don't require explanation under stress. Diverse groups spend critical time negotiating basic interaction patterns while crisis is actively unfolding. This doesn't mean diverse neighborhoods can't cooperate. It means they require more pre-existing social capital to overcome the coordination friction that homogeneous neighborhoods don't face. Hurricane Katrina data shows this uncomfortably clearly. Neighborhoods that were either uniformly African American or uniformly white organized mutual aid faster than economically and physically similar neighborhoods with mixed populations. Researchers initially assumed this reflected pre-existing racial tension, but deeper investigation showed the pattern held even in neighborhoods with no history of racial conflict. The delay in diverse neighborhoods wasn't hostility, it was coordination friction. Different cultural assumptions about leadership, decision-making, resource sharing, and security created negotiation overhead that slowed response. One particularly telling example involved two neighborhoods with nearly identical demographics except for ethnic composition. The homogeneous neighborhood established a functional security patrol and resource network within 18 hours. The diverse neighborhood took 4 days to establish similar coordination because residents spent the first 72 hours negotiating who should lead, how decisions should be made, and what rules should govern behavior. Both neighborhoods eventually succeeded in organizing cooperation, but the time delay in the diverse neighborhood led to preventable suffering and several preventable deaths.
Now here's what all of this means for you personally and what you need to do with this information. First, honestly assess your street against these 7 factors. Walk your neighborhood and count how many neighbors you can name. Count how many you've had conversations with in the past month. Count how many you've ever exchanged favors with. Look at whether people sit on porches or hide in backyards. Notice whether kids play together or stay isolated. Check whether your street is economically homogeneous or mixed. Determine whether families or individuals dominate. Ask whether your neighborhood has survived a previous crisis together. Examine the physical design for social capital generation or prevention. And assess, uncomfortable as it is, the ethnic and cultural composition homogeneity. These factors will predict your street's crisis response with about 85% accuracy based on disaster research data. Second, understand what you can change and what you cannot. You cannot change your street's physical design or ethnic composition or whether it has prior crisis experience. You can marginally influence economic diversity by moving, but most people can't afford to choose neighborhoods based on income homogeneity. What you can change is social capital. You could introduce yourself to neighbors you've never spoken to. You could organize or attend neighborhood events. You can exchange small favors that build trust. You can create reasons for regular, casual interaction. This is not about making friends. This is about building the minimal social capital necessary to enable cooperation under stress. If your assessment reveals low social capital and you cannot or will not move, then building social capital becomes your primary preparation, more important than stockpiles or skills. Third, recognize that some neighborhoods are simply not salvageable for cooperative crisis response. If you live on a street with low social capital, high economic diversity, low network closure, no families, no prior crisis experience, privacy-focused design, and high ethnic diversity, the probability of cooperative response during extended crisis approaches zero. This is not pessimism, this is mathematics. That combination of factors has never produced cooperation in any studied disaster. Your options in that scenario are accept the risk, invest years building social capital against the odds, or relocate to a neighborhood with better structural factors. There is no fourth option. Hoping your street will spontaneously organize when crisis hits, despite every predictor indicating it won't, is the same fatal optimism that kills preppers who believe their gear will save them despite living in Phoenix. Fourth, understand that your personal preparations mean nothing if your neighborhood turns predatory. Your stockpile becomes bait. Your security measures become challenges that mark you as worth attacking. Your skills become irrelevant when you're defending against coordinated groups. The preppers who died with full pantries during Katrina weren't killed by the hurricane, they were killed by their neighbors. Their preparation made them targets on streets that went predatory. Conversely, the preppers who survived on streets that organized cooperation often had fewer individual resources but benefited from collective security and resource pooling. Location at the neighborhood level determines whether your preparations help or hurt. Get this wrong and everything else becomes irrelevant. Fifth, if your assessment reveals your neighborhood has poor structural factors for cooperation, your primary strategic option is building relationships with the minority of neighbors who show cooperation potential, creating a small network within the larger failing neighborhood. During disasters, even streets that generally fragment often see small clusters of 2 to 5 houses that organize mutual aid. If you can identify and build relationships with the neighbors most likely to cooperate, you can create a micro-network that survives even as the broader street fails. Look for families with children, longer-term residents who know others on the street, people who are already helping neighbors with small things, anyone who shows community orientation during normal times. Build relationships with them specifically and explicitly. This is strategic social capital investment.
The mathematics are brutal but simple. Your neighborhood's social structure determines whether crisis produces cooperation or predation. That structure exists now and is measurable using the 7 factors identified by disaster research. Some factors you can influence, most you cannot. The single most important preparation you can make is honest assessment of your street, followed by either building social capital if the structure allows it, or relocating if it doesn't. Everything else, your gear, your stockpiles, your skills, matters only after you've solved the neighborhood problem. Get your street wrong, and perfect individual preparation becomes a liability that marks you for predation. Get your street right, and minimal individual preparation gets multiplied by collective action. Your neighbor knocking on your door 72 hours after the power fails will either be asking if you need help or demanding your supplies. That decision has already been made by the social structure you're living in right now. The question is whether you've assessed which scenario you're facing and whether you're doing anything about it before the knock comes. Choose accordingly. Comment below. What's your honest assessment of your street? High social capital or strangers living side by side? If you've lived through a neighborhood crisis, tell us whether your street cooperated or fragmented and which factors predicted it. Subscribe if you want survival analysis based on social science and disaster research, not hopeful fantasies about communities magically forming under stress. Every video on this channel examines what actually works when conventional wisdom gets you killed. This is Fallout Rat.
Stay filthy, stay smart, stay rational when everyone else is hoping their neighbors will help, instead of measuring whether they actually will.